Go. All right, guys, how you doing today? Ted Elsner, Sacramento Historical Fencing Academy. I want to start off with a happy Mother's Day to all of the moms out there. And as part of that, my wife for Mother's Day has asked that during class here, I keep an eye on my daughter. So we may have some interruptions occurring as things go so that mom can have a few minutes of free time inside. And Kara gets to join us outside. So while we're working, there may be a bit of baby. Just be prepared for that. Anyway, today we're going to finish up with our discussion of the Meisterhau. The Zwerch, however you want to pronounce it, right? The thwart, whatever we want to call it, is the kind of final of the cuts that we need to get out of the way. Now, we'll talk about the Scheitelhau and we'll talk about the Zornhau as Meisterhau next week. But we've already kind of gone over those since they are just specific usage of primary cuts. We'll do them at the same time. But we're going to finish up with the Zwerch, the Twer, however we want to pronounce it today. So let me just kind of pop that so I can see what's going on. Excellent. The Twer is a really important cut, the Zwerch, etc. It is used primarily as mire. To deal with anything that comes from above. Now, when Meyer is talking about this cut, he kind of goes into, with a little bit of help from Jeffrey Foring's translation, notes on how in modern fencing, right, for his period, that if the cut didn't exist, fully half of fencing would be lost. As Foring translates, it would go out the window. It's a cut that, like last week when we started to look at flanking our opponent and how we can use certain actions to come around from a side, the thwart is going to be that kind of situation where rather than trying to dominate the center line directly, we're looking to kind of move around the opponent's attack even as we're catching it and have our response come in from a very interesting angle. When we look at this cut today and we start to play around with it, one of the most common applications of it that we see in any kind of modern tournament setting is the everyone loves it, the Zwerchcopter, right? This series of cuts from one side to the other as we cut back and forth. And certainly that's attested to in Meyer and in other sources, right? Where Meyer will do it with like the Zwerch with a failer, where he'll throw the first one, when the person goes to parry it, he'll fail it and immediately strike it around to the other side. And that's an option, certainly. But an area that we often overlook with the Zwerch as well is that it sets us up for a binding situation and then allows us to wind. And that's actually where I want to start with today as we kind of get into it and look at it, is how Meyer recommends using the cut to set up the bind, to wrench and wind from there. Now, conveniently today, I do have the assistance of Jacob, who will be jumping in to help me work on it as we go through this and look at it. And so that's kind of where we're gonna start, is with this kind of discussion of what can we do from the cut. Then we'll back up. Oops, pardon me. We'll back up to how to do the cut and how to train it, and then finally kind of bring it back full circle and using it effectively. Let me make sure all my streams and everything are looking good here. It looks like we're doing okay. So let's go ahead and talk about the Zwerch. Out of my way. All right. There we go. So all right, so Jacob will come in and join me for this, and we kind of look at it. This way a little bit, Jacob. There we go. Perfect. All right, so starting a little bit close. One of these days I'm going to get this fixed and have my GoPro to switch over from as well to be able to have a little bit wider of a angle on this. Yes, my dear. With this cut, before we even get to the initial binding, one of the things that's really interesting, and we see show up both in the earlier material and in Meyer, is rather than just coming straight up with the cut with a short edge, Meyer does it with a series of short edge slashes first. We also see versions that lead with a thrust. I think this is actually really fundamentally important to what we're about to do and what makes the Zwerchhau the Zwerchhau. If I come up with a slash to provoke an action from Jacob, if I'm down here, he may be thinking Scheitelhau, right? He's thinking, oh, I'm going to cut right at his head, which is perfect. That's what I want from him, right? Is I want that attack to be a nice straight attack from above, which then, as I transition up with my Zwerch, catching on the short edge and sending forward, gets us in a position to really threaten him nicely, okay? And that's where I want to end up. Now, if I can hit him with the initial strike, that's fine, but I may find myself in a position here where we've bound on. Meyer then immediately on this is going to have us start to wind over and go for a wrenching action. And he'll actually have us turn the edge to drive over in reverse as we press down, and then from there come back with a short edge strike, or we could come up with a cut. Really, any of them. Our goal in that kind of scenario from that binding is going to be pressing Jacob down, or our opponent down, into flug, right? Into a flug-like posture on his lower right side. That, if you followed my videos then on the row stock, is where we want that binding to occur. We're taking it into that outer ring, so we then have a clear line of attack back safely to his openings. Either with the thrust, with the cut, with the slice, depending on, kind of how Jacob is responding to actions at that point. And it can go, kind of either side with that. There's no reason as well that I couldn't potentially threaten from here, right? Come up and catch with the long edge in the same way, threatening him and pressing forward and really, kind of showing that safety as I'm there. And from here, if Jacob starts to rise his sword back up as I'm lifting away, oh, okay, well then, bam, we can easily pop around to strike that Zwerch from the other side as well, threatening his face, his eyes, his nose, right? Whichever parts of his sensitive anatomy that he might be concerned about. Kind of disconcerting, right, without a mask on?
I don't think I'd be very handsome without my nose.
Most people aren't. Most people aren't. So when we're doing those Zwerchs, while certainly for home practice, you can be practicing striking around and around and around. If you have the ability to set up your Pel with a sword that you can bind onto, using it then as a setup for a binding action to wrench, to control, to take it where you want to, is going to be kind of a fundamental important part. But let's back out a little bit now and look at kind of the mechanics of what we're trying to do with this Zwerch to begin with. Like I said, while we can certainly start it from something like a shoulder Vomtag position, and Meyer notes it from here, it's not really our best position to begin from. If Jacob starts to strike in from here and I just go straight forward, my hands in this kind of scenario are very likely to take a strike. Instead, if we're hanging out here in Zornhut, now when he strikes in, I can get a little bit more space, but I still don't love it. Yes, my dear? Yeah. Where's your sword? They're on this side. Can you see your swords? Pardon me a moment. No?
Army of the toddler.
Yes. Hey, army of toddlers, right? Why not? About to get disconnected as she runs around and stabs everything. Nothing wrong with giving a 2-year-old a sword, right? No, I don't think so. So anyway, it's one of the things that we can look at. And arguably, it really does call for, if we're in a Zornhut, if we're in a shoulder Vomtag kind of position, that, yes, that responding with a Zornhau to an attack from above may be a better choice. On the other hand, if I'm in some kind of low guard position where I'm really trying to draw that Scheitelhau targeting the head, then our slashing up takes us through a couple of different positions. One, worst case, if we're going a little bit slow, we might find ourselves coming up, catching in, some kind of cron-like position where we bind upon him and then are able to strike over, but we're getting the hands up there protecting our head. If I get up there in time where I've slipped through and I can come around to the side, again, I can end up in arguably a cron-like position still, right? I've got horizontal quillions above my head or even slightly angled as I come up and catch them and strike into it. But I'm not just exposing my hands through the whole strike as I try and come up with it and spring out and hope that I get there in time. very difficult to do this strike when you have a object down below that you don't want to strike unintentionally. Yeah, hi, you gonna get it? Yeah, yeah. Oh, get that overbind. Uh-huh. Press to the side. Yeah. Oh. Oh. You gonna go get that? Go get that. Me get it? Or you get it? Don't work with toddlers. It's just our general kind of rule. So, anyway, with this, as we're coming up from below, right, we've drawn in this attack. You're gonna go get Jacob? Go get Jacob. Go get him. We're going to get this attack from below, right? We're hanging out in a posture that's encouraging the attack to come in from above. We're going to slash up initially to get the sword really out in front of us, right? In a protective position. Then from there, be able to execute the cut. Difficult to show at the moment. Doing it with a spring out as well. Okay? So if I was fencing against you, right, and I'm really trying to draw that attack, right? Come for the head. Maybe I'm provoking and creating opportunities for Nachreisen for attacking in tempo, however we want to consider it. As the strike comes in and we bring it up through, getting that transition with a spring out to the side to get the strike to come around, right? Then if we're in the bind at that point, turning our edge, winding over the top to drive down, again, taking a step in the process, right? We've kind of gone through a crump-like motion at that point to press the opponent down into Flug. Then we can just unwind if we wanted to in a Shielhau style action. We can come out of there and Zwerch again, right? And kind of double his Zwerch on the side if we want to. So that we come up, we strike, bam, we wind over, we press down as we step, and then strike around again, doubling back into that same opening, having controlled the opponent's sword out of the way, bringing the strike in, and then immediately able to come back down on their sword, right? When you're practicing that, things to think about for it. If I've come in, and I've struck, and I've wound, and I've driven down to the side, and I want to Zwerch again, I can, but then being ready to always find the opponent's bind after any strike that we're delivering to them. Too often, we'll deliver that strike, whether it's in free sparring or a tournament, and we'll just stop, right? It's like, no, hit them, and then immediately come back to where their sword is going to be. Meyer is distinct about this. It is an element that will serve us all really, really well to go from the body to the sword, to the body to the sword. And he notes that in the discussion of the Zornhut plays, that all of his strikes are going to go from the sword to the body to the sword to the body to the sword to the body, right? He's not just cutting at the body repeatedly. Some of them are absolutely attempting to gain control of the opponent's blade and work from there. So, as we go through on that and look at it, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of bring this together and turn it into a little bit of a drill for Jacob to run through with myself and kind of work on this, assuming that I don't have a munchkin that decides to get directly underfoot. If you're going to use that sword, Jacob, let me switch swords, or grab your brigade. You can leave those. Whenever possible, trying to use similar swords against each other so that we have a kind of a better source of feedback. So, okay. Yeah. So, as we turn this into a drill, right? The first thing that we want to look at is kind of build up to the provocation that's going to result in Jacob wanting to attack my head, right? And we can get this a number of different ways, but I really want to show that. Now, I have to be careful. One, we're starting at a very close distance because of the camera, right? We're well within range. I can reach out and strike Jacob from this distance without having to move. So we're too close. 100%. this is the distance where we're going to get into as we finish. So if I step back, and I'll have to be out of frame a little bit, my initial strikes, as I'm going to come together with this, is going to have to gather his sword and give me room to work. I need to move safely through that weak distance. And one of the ways that I can do that is moving in here and provoking just out of range with maybe coming down into Alber to really draw that attack from above, especially if I've struck into it and see if he thinks that he can just reach me, right? Even better is if he just can't quite reach me and has to work a little bit harder. Ideally, we want that distance where we're 1.5 steps away. My step brings me into a range just outside of his, and then I can work from there. Okay? So, what's wrong? Totally going to try not to step on my daughter as I do this. So I've come in. Jacob says, oh, I want to strike at your head. So he steps in and strikes. Bam. Okay? I'm going to get into that range. His strike comes, and we're going to come up and catch high. Right? Out in front of us, spring out to the side, threaten the face. Now, a couple of different things can happen from here that we can kind of look at, right? Is one would just be that we immediately do the Zwerch and we strike in. We don't get him. We strike around. That assumes that he does something, goes back up with his blade. That's one possibility. And certainly a popular one, but not the one that we're going to work on today. Instead, what I want to look at is we come in, we go there, Jacob comes in, we strike through, and he decides to say, oh, I don't want to get hit in the face, right? So he's going to push off to the side, right? So that would absolutely give us the reason to strike around. But even better than that, if we know that that's going to be what's coming, and as he goes to push, press over, right, take our sword out to the side, use his own force to gather to our strong to get that control, and now we can do a double step around without stepping on our daughter, and strike our second, and then right back down in. Hi, buds. What's wrong? No, I can't go inside right now. Daddy will go in a minute. Okay? What's wrong? Pardon me a moment. Come here. Oh, okay. Okay. How are we doing? How are we doing? Just checking if I'm having issues on my end. Still going. Okay. All right. So, I'll do this one-handed. Right? We're going to come in, press up and through, and catch, winding over, pressing down to strike again with our Zwerch. Strike in, wind, strike, strike. Don't do this while holding a child. Okay. Yeah? Okay. No, I can't go inside right now. I can't go inside right now. Yeah. No, can I put you down? So anyway, all right, we'll pause for a moment while she has her shyness fit here, and then work on it some more in just a moment. Ugh. No? Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. This is what happens, right, when you're stuck at home for long periods of time. For all you dads out there that don't realize what, mom is going through, realize it. Not easy. Oh. Yeah, sword. Mm-hmm. So anyway, yeah, kind of getting thrown off my train of thought on that. Jacob, while I'm sitting here on a distracted train of thought, questions, comments?
Just that stepping off to the side.
Yes.
This work is very important.
Yes.
You don't want to step in. That's going to mess you up real bad.
Absolutely. Jacob makes an amazing point, right? We are trying to flank our opponent to the side. We want to come around on them from an angle, not by moving straight in. Moving straight in We're going to set up the pressures wrong and go from there. That does bring up, though, one thing that we can do with this, and that is to use a false step. Oh, you want those? Use a false step instead of a flanking step, right? And so our spring out to the side, replace it by stepping across the line. Can you go see Mama? No? Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Yes, and Peter, let me describe footwork, and I'll change the camera here in just a second. Okay, well, I will do this with footwork without a sword. Okay, so let me bring the camera down a bit as well to adjust, pardon me, the footwork angles. Okay, so almost there. We'll just drop this all the way down. Miracle of live video. Okay, so here we go. As best as possible. As I do my footwork for this, right, it's going to be our step. Rather than stepping straight in, we definitely want to see this executed with a spring off to the side. Now, there may end up being a little bit of a triangle step that occurs with it as well. We just want to avoid necessarily taking that huge triangle step around unless we're explicitly looking to use it to set ourselves up for a double step. If it's done intentionally, it's fine, but if it's done unintentionally, it causes problems. What I was alluding to, though, as a secondary option to this would be a false step, where instead of stepping off to my right, I can actually step through to my left, the opponent's right, as I strike it, so that when I catch their strike, it will be much more likely to end up on my strong, but towards my weak in such a way that it'll want to run off, which I can then snap around and continue with a passing step to my left, the opponent's right. But in either case, I'm not stepping directly forward. I'm stepping to one side or to the other and trying to get around my opponent's flank. Okay? Hopefully that answers your question, Peter, for it. Anything else, Jacob? No. Excellent. So when you practice this Zwerch, a couple of things to note. If your shoes are not slippery enough, right? If they have too much traction, it is possible to hurt your knee while doing this because there is going to be some rotational torque that's going into it. And I've definitely seen the mistake before where people are using shoes that grip too well and they try and turn and it puts all that force into the knee. So kind of be aware of that. Modern fencing shoes on a smooth environment that are great for forward and back kind of lunging and rapier-like motions, not the best when practicing the Zwerch or using it against people. Seen problems with people's knees getting injured in that situation. Mom's got something for you. That's some chocolate. Bribe the child with chocolate. Can you go see Mama? There we go. When in doubt, bribe them with chocolate. Right. So, we'll do the false step version, right? So, as I come up and I strike in and he comes, I'm going to step across, which is going to put him on my strong, but in such a way that it's going to run off, and then I can strike around, either with a Zornhau back down through, I could Zwerch again, a suppressing cut, whatever the case may be. So that is a situation where, as we look at it, coming up from below, bringing that off to the side, hooking over, if we wanted to wrestle at that point, get behind the knee so we can press the knee, elbow in the face, etc., etc. Breaking our social distancing requirements and giving ourselves the plague. Okay? So either well off to the side, where we catch nice and strong and we can resist it with force, or through, where we're not going to resist it with force, we're going to let it run off and continue our action around. Okay? In either case. Let's talk about actually during the process of this also gripping the sword. So most of the time, I like hands together when doing cuts, but this is a perfect example of how slipping the hand out is going to be ideal and transitioning to the pommel so that we can get a better angle on it. And you see this when you see Meyer's depictions of these kind of positions, that he tends to be holding onto the pommel at that point versus when he's in closer and maybe looking like he's doing a regular cutting, having his hands together. Okay, so as you're working through on this cut, realize that you're going to have those hands kind of transitioning around. As I come up and I slip out, I'm switching to the pommel to strike. I don't want to keep the hands in close at that point. It's not doing me any stability favors. Yeah, and Peter, in answer to your question, always the slice is a option that you can take. So if he runs off to your side because you've stepped through and you don't have space to work and you want to put the slice on, 100% you can do that. Or you could strike, or you could wrench, or you could thrust. It really depends on ultimately what your opponent is doing, right? So if I'm doing this with Jacob, and I come in and he catches here, bam. If Jacob, as it runs off, moves backwards, right? He realizes that he wants to make space for himself, then yeah, I might strike or set myself up there. On the other hand, if we've come in here and Jacob's pressing hard on me, right, a wrenching over the top is going to be a better choice, or, you know, a slice maybe as well. If he starts to strike around from this one, right, and he decides to come around, in that kind of situation, just transitioning the slice directly to the arms and closing it out is going to be a lot better to work with. Just use 6 foot long swords. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Go grab the. Did you bring your montante?
Not today.
Next time. Montante is next time. Or I'll grab the quarterstaffs, and we'll just do all this with quarterstaff and work from there. And then I definitely have to switch to a longer, wider field of view. Yeah, wider angle lens from there. Kind of, but regardless, as you're working through on this, guys, how we respond after that initial part of the strike is really going to be dictated by the situation, right? I can't say, oh, I'm gonna come into this and I'm gonna put the slice on, or I'm gonna wrench, and if I try to do that, right? If I come in and I say, okay, I want to wrench, boom, I want to come over and wrench, and I start to go around. If Jacob takes a step back, now he's got the slice, right? And he can take that step back, gain the distance, put it on, and then just drive me back in. What am I going to do at that point as I get collapsed with the sword through my, face and hands? Because I made the mistake of not lingering for just a moment, right? We come back to bleiben. We come back to that remaining, where I have to sense his intent in the moment of the bind occurring, feel the feeling, oh, okay, he's backing up. I'm going to strike around out of there. Or I feel him come in, boom, and he's just standing there. Okay, perfect. Let's wrench and turn it into a throw. Or we strike and feel him start to leave. Oh, slice. Okay? Have to respond to your opponent, right? That's one of the things that makes this the most difficult right now for people practicing at home is, we can practice our very basic cuts and actions like that, and we can work with a pel and strike against a non-living opponent, but the choice of how we finish our various winds, our various actions, ultimately are dictated by the situation, which includes not just our intent, but especially the intent of our opponent, okay? So hopefully once this all ends, you'll bear that in mind when you go to class, and you'll think about, okay, as I do these things, how do they change based on how my opponent responds, okay? All right. Any other questions that you have that we can go in through this? I know it's been a little bit kind of all over the place. That's what happens. It's Mother's Day. My kid is being a kid. If you have questions, throw them in the comments. Otherwise, guys, this week we'll have the last parts of the rules of the Rostock going up on YouTube, and then we're going to get into all of the fun discussions of the rules of the Rostock and kind of the implications that it plays for us on all the other things. Like I said, also next week we'll be working on the Zornhau and the Scheitelhau as Meisterhau through this, before we then kind of move on to some defensive actions in the future as well. I think that's it. Jacob, do you have anything to add?
No.
All right. Love all my assistants. Men of few words. So, I don't see any other questions popping up. In that case, guys, hopefully this has been helpful to you today, and we will come back and talk about it more in the future, I'm sure. Oh, wait, Peter got one in before. Would there be any consideration for Zwerch with the rapier? So, if you're cutting, right, like there are times where Meyer will do, Zwerch-like actions with one-handed weapons. Some of the leverage changes, certainly, right? If I'm doing a single hand and striking in and not having that second hand on there, it does change a number of the leverage operations. But at the same time, it is still the same windings, right? We're still striking in and finding ourselves in that upper bind. And depending on where I'm at, if I've stepped through, right, I'm going to have the pressure on the outside of my sword, which is going to lend itself to running off and striking around. Whereas if I've stepped out to the side and caught, I should be able to then bind and wind back in. At the end of the day, the Zwerch is setting us up to enter into a bind that we can wind just like we want to do with pretty much all of our actions, right? Find his sword, get his sword. Once we're on his sword, we know where he's at, and then we can safely respond from there and go from there. Now, if we're talking rapier, against somebody that likes to stab a lot and is point in line, don't try and Zwerch, right? If Jacob is being a rapier guy with his point in line, I'm not going to want to try and do any kind of Zwerch. That is really stupid. What am I going to do? I'm going to Zwerch down here. Great. I'm going to get stabbed, right? But if he's going to cut, then we can work with it in rapier. I'll have to pull the rapiers out, and we can do that in a future video. I just don't have them with me today, unfortunately. So something to look at. Thank you for the question, nonetheless, Peter. I think that's it. That was a good question.
What about height? Height of the Zwerch.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, the Zwerch can go, ultimately, the attack to either the upper or lower openings, right? So I can choose to Zwerch to the ox up high or Zwerch to the flute. But in either situations, I want my hands to be above my head as a parrying, right? Because I'm taking an attack that's coming from above. I'm trying to make sure that I bind on it and work from it. But there's no reason that I can't then attack to a lower opening. So if Jacob attacks from up high and I catch, bam, this, right, a parry that occurs here with hands high for a parrying, if I'm making attacks down into the body, that's still going to prompt certain responses from him, right? He may not want to get stabbed in the stomach, in the, in the hip, and so your pressure is going to come off to the side and say, oh, okay, I'm gonna strike around or I'm gonna push down low. In which case, cool. Now you're pressing down onto my sword, right? And I might just choose an Umschnappen right out of there. But hands high, because if I try and do that same thing with hands low and attack low, I get hit in the head. In which case, oops, not great. Okay, so yeah, height can be ox or to the flug. You can attack with the point to either of those, but you need to protect your head. Your hands are above your head in a parry to protect your head. Okay, cool. All right, otherwise, guys, I think that about wraps it up for us for today. So if I don't see any other questions appear here in just a second, we're going to call it a day and watch our videos through the rest of the week. Be here next week as well as we'll progress and go further. I was drinking a lot yesterday also, so you have to forgive me. So I think that's it. Otherwise, guys, it has been a pleasure, and we will see you next time.